Aloha and welcome everyone to today's Virtual Connect webinar, Hawaii Economic and Housing Update. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please let us know in the chat box. If you have questions about the presentation, you can submit using the Q&A function. We will have a Q&A session after Dr. Bonham's presentation. Additionally, a recording of the session and a copy of the slides will be sent to all attendees. On this webinar, we have Dr. Carl Bonham from the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, or UHERO, as well as Leonard Leventhal and Tim O'Leary from Guaranteed Rate. Guaranteed Rate is sponsoring this session for our members, so big mahalo to Leonard and Tim. I'll now hand it off to Leonard so we can learn more about this company.
Morning. Thank you, Christina. I would like to start off by introducing Tim O'Leary, who many of you have met and worked with, I'm sure, over the years. Tim is going to share a few bits of information, a little bit of an update on what's going on with Guaranteed Rate. With that, Tim, take it away.
Thank you, Leonard and Christina. And thank you all for attending today. It's definitely going to be an informative session. Okay, so some of the relevant facts that Guaranteed Rate practices, I think this will be helpful for you to understand as you deal with your clients for buyers. So Guaranteed Rate, before COVID, we actually had a very airtight kind of online, very virtual close from beginning to end. So even now we're very much, we follow the COVID airtight protocol. That way it keeps your clients safe. We still have the ability to execute a purchase transaction within a 30-day time frame for most transactions. With our modern mortgage experience platform, clients can literally check their credit. They can automatically verify their income, their employment, and they can actually link up their bank accounts with our system, which we can securely verify their assets on a transaction, thereby not requiring a bank statement in many cases. You know, and this allows for our files to meet the demands of today's market, which is fast paced. So we're excited about that, and we're having a excellent year like most. You know, the team of Guaranteed Rate, we've all known each other probably for 30 years. There's a long list of experienced veteran loan officers. So we're very familiar with many of you and we're familiar with each other. So we really make up a very diverse and very experienced team. So you can trust that we'll make sure to get your transactions through in a timely manner. And then, you know, we offer very competitive rates and fees in the marketplace. We're willing to, you know, to be competitive. We want to deliver. We want to have return clients. We want you to feel comfortable and confident in referring business to us. And one of the great facts of Guaranteed Rate is that we've measured that 96% of customers who have done a transaction with us would recommend us, which is an industry high. So thank you so much for all of your support, and please enjoy Doctor's presentation. Back to you, Len.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you for the background. Appreciate it. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Dr. Bonham and let him get started with his program. Dr. Carl Bonham serves as UHERO's Executive Director and Professor of Economics. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin and was a founding member of UHERO in 1997. His research interests include macroeconomics, applied economics and forecasting, tourism economics, and the Hawaii economy. Dr. Bonham is also a member of the State of Hawaii Council on Revenues and the House Select Committee on COVID-19 Economic and Financial Preparedness. Today, Dr. Bonham will be providing us with a general economic overview and a statewide update on housing. Thank you very much for helping us today, Dr. Bonham, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Leonard. I appreciate the introduction. It's good to be here. So if at any point you can't hear me or my slides freeze or anything, someone wave at me. I can still see you. The conversation today is mostly framed by UHERO's forecast that we released back in September. We're in the middle of preparing our our forecast update for the fourth quarter, and we're hoping to get that out during the month of November, but it may slip into early December. And usually we would start right in on the forecast, but just a little bit of background on UHERO. So some of you may not be aware that we do a lot more than just forecasting. We also have a group that does analytics that runs all of our data portals. We have 5 or 6 data portals that we host for ourselves, the UHERO data portal, and then we also host data portals and dashboards for the state, for the County of Hawaii, for the Chamber of Commerce, for Kauai County. We have a large group that does energy work that is focused on how do we hit Hawaii's renewable energy goals in a manner that is low cost and equitable. Our environmental policy and planning group is the largest group. They basically are focused on sustainability, natural resource management, watershed management. 4 or 5 faculty and staff work on that group. I think you're familiar with the doom and gloom group. And then there's recently, actually a few years ago, we received a generous contribution from the Hawaii Community Reinvestment Corporation and several other nonprofit housing groups and financial institutions that allowed us to establish an endowed chair in affordable housing. And actually, Phil Garboden, the housing chair, is speaking at a House committee today on housing and on the rental assistance program. And one of the things that the housing group has done during the pandemic in collaboration with analytics is to launch a rental survey for property owners and property managers. And I encourage you to participate in that survey if you haven't, if you're a property owner. So jump right into the forecast. Normally I would spend a fair amount of time talking about the US economy, Japanese economy, rest of the world, but there's so much to cover that I'm going to keep it short and just look at consumer sentiment for the US. It's a very important piece, both for Hawaii because of essentially the need to get travelers back in the state, and the attitudes that consumers have about their economic situation in the US took a record fall in April, and largest fall ever recorded. We've seen some recovery, and it's sort of up and down depending on the status of the pandemic and the opening or closing of various economies across the country. And as you can see right now, we're right at about, in terms of overall perceptions that consumers have about the economy, we're about where we were just at the beginning of the stronger part of the recovery from the Great Recession. I mean, the Great Recession ended obviously in 2009, but the recovery was very slow for the first several years, and most of the recovery happened between 2014 and 2016. On the right side, you can see this graph shows you the growth rates or the percent change in sentiment from February to April. It was an over 30% drop in US consumer sentiment. And in Hawaii, so this is a new index that we just started collecting for Hawaii, the percentage drop was even larger, and we really haven't seen much recovery yet for Hawaii. We'll be getting the the September number shortly, and all that data is available on the UHERO data portal. So where does Hawaii's economy stand today? Well, unfortunately, we have the unenviable distinction of having the weakest economy in the entire country. This map shows the percentage Q1 to Q2 percentage drop in real gross domestic product annualized. And so Hawaii saw a 42.2% drop in output in the second quarter of the year. The only other state that saw that kind of drop was Nevada, another state that's heavily dependent on tourism. Unfortunately, Hawaii's drop in the first quarter was much larger than Nevada's. So for the first half of the year, we really do have the distinction of the weakest economy. So real GDP measures everything that's produced in the state. And we will see a bounce back in the third quarter, because you remember in the second quarter of the year, that was when we were effectively shut down, right? We had stay-at-home orders statewide, and clearly no visitor activity during that period. Notice that the U.S. growth rate was minus 31%. And so most states were seeing growth rates in the minus 30% range. And it's expected that when we get the third quarter number for the U.S. as a whole, it will be a bounce back of roughly plus 30%. But as you all know, when you decline by 30% and then you grow by 30%, you're not back where you started. You're still well below the level of economic activity that we had before we went into this pandemic. And if you look at employment, it's a similar picture. So this data, so the GDP data came out at the beginning of October. The employment data, we just got the September jobs report, and year over year, Hawaii's job losses, these are payroll jobs, fell 18.4%. So September 2020, there were 18.4% fewer jobs in Hawaii than September of 2019. And the next closest was New York at minus 11.2, Michigan at 9.6. On the West Coast, the closest is minus 9 for Nevada and minus 9 for Alaska. And if you look at the unemployment rate, Hawaii now has the highest unemployment rate in the country at 15.1%. And very few states are anywhere close to that. So the overall picture is one of a very weak economy. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of how we got here. This slide is actually from our forecast in May. It's quite a long time ago in pandemic terms. And back in when we released this forecast at the end of May, we still didn't have, well, actually, when we were working on preparing it in April and the early part of May, we had no data on how many jobs were going to be lost because of the pandemic. And if you remember, we had our first stay-at-home order at the end of March. And so everybody except essential businesses were shut down during the month of April. We had essentially no visitors, right? We had the start of the 14-day quarantine, and we had no data on how many jobs would be lost. And so what we did was we started some surveys of small businesses to ask them about their exposure to tourism and to ask them about their job losses that they were experiencing. And we turned to the initial claims for unemployment benefits as well. And those initial claims were over 200,000 at the time. So we, combining that data with the survey data, and we came up with an estimate of a 220,000 job loss in April. Well, it turns out that those initial claims, over a third of them were invalid, either because they were fraudulent or they were duplicates. You go onto the website and you try to file a claim, and then the system crashes, so you do it again, and then the system crashes and you do it again. So now you have 3 claims. So about a third of these were invalid, and we actually only ended up with about 170,000 job losses, which is a good thing, obviously. We did get, and so then once we had decided where the bottom was, right? You lose, it turned out 170, we thought it would be 220. We needed to estimate what the recovery would look like. So we gathered data on the PPP loans. We made an assumption that Hawaii would begin to reopen the local economy in the middle of May. That turned out to be accurate. And our estimate of the jobs that would be recovered from PPP loans was relatively accurate. We expected 80,000 job recovery. We got about 70,000 jobs recovered. And then we thought that when the PPP loans would end, because we assumed tourism would not resume until the end of July, there would be some fall off in employment and then a slow recovery as tourism reopened. Well, obviously we got the tourism reopening wrong. The surge in cases on the mainland and the challenge with setting up testing programs and just plain slow response by state government meant that we didn't reopen in July, and we didn't get this kind of recovery. In fact, after the 70,000 job recovery, things really went sideways. And what happened, So this is a slide from UHERO's data portal, our analyzer, that shows two different lines. And the dark blue line is the number of cases. It's measured over here on the left axis, number of COVID cases. And so what happened is after, and this is weekly data. So after having basically no cases during the month of June, extremely low. If you remember back, we're talking 1 case a day, 3 cases a day, very, very low numbers. Come July, the case counts, particularly on Oahu, grew by 2 to 3-fold. So statewide, by mid-July, we were seeing weekly case counts of between 1,000 and 1,500. And so what happened? Well, people stayed home. And after having unemployment claims go down, they shot right back up again with the rise in the case counts. And fortunately, things have improved with the second shutdown. But notice the rising unemployment claims happened even before the Oahu stay-at-home order. And so essentially, the spread of the virus shut the economy down again, even before any kind of stay-at-home order. And we ended up with very widespread job losses. The one sector on Oahu that hasn't lost jobs is construction. So we actually saw a growth in construction jobs on Oahu, but not on the neighbor islands. Statewide, this number is just slightly positive. Statewide, finance and insurance is just slightly negative, and healthcare and social assistance is slightly negative. But in no case do we have actually federal government. These are all private sector jobs. Federal government civilian jobs have actually grown slightly as well. And all the other sectors have seen large job losses. It's hard to find a sector that hasn't seen at least 10% job losses. This is through September. So it's the first 9 months of the year compared to the first 9 months of last year, with accommodations seeing statewide about 38% job losses. Eating and drinking, food service and eating drinking is at about 33% job losses statewide. And you have quite a bit of variability across islands. Some of it makes good sense. Some of it's a little confusing. So, why real estate job losses on Maui are so much smaller than on other islands is pretty hard to explain. The numbers for Maui, Big Island, and Kauai come from very small surveys, and so and all this data will be revised. I expect that the real estate job losses on Maui will be right on par with all the other islands. But it's very, very widespread losses, and a challenge for forecasting is understanding where you are at any given point. I mentioned earlier that we just got the second quarter GDP data at the beginning of October, right? So it's the beginning of the fourth quarter, and we just got the preliminary estimate for what the second quarter looked like.
Sorry,
And
Dr.
then
Bonham?
actually, yes.
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Would it be possible to make the screen a little larger on your end, if it's possible? We have a few requests. I don't know if there's like
Let's
a full
see.
screen option.
Should be in full screen.
Oh, yeah, it got larger for a second there.
You mean like this?
Yes, yes,
Or-
I think that's.
So that's larger for you than, never had that happen before.
Oh, yes, it's showing up larger for us.
Okay,
Now.
I can do it that way if that's
Yeah. Thank you.
okay. Let's see if I can. Okay, we'll stick with that view. It's not in presentation mode, but apparently, so is that okay now?
Yes, it's showing up much larger.
Okay. And I assume you can't see my pointer anymore.
I can see your mouse, but.
Okay, good. All right. So what I was talking about was the fact that we don't have, so we just got the September employment data last week, and middle of October, and we're just getting the data for jobs in September. So one of the things that we are doing at UHERO is gathering information that we normally would not have worked with. In fact, much of it wasn't available until the pandemic, and it's data that's collected by businesses and so in the course of, so for example, ProService payrolls. So we're working with ProService Hawaii, and they're providing us with data on payrolls, not individual companies, but data aggregated by industry, and we're getting that from them every 2 weeks. So it's a high frequency. Everything we're working with here is either daily or weekly data. We have job postings, we have the number of small businesses open from Womply and small business revenue. That's the light blue line here. The dark blue line here is number of hours worked. The gold line here is employees, number of employees who are back at work. And what we've done, Peter Filecki wrote a research paper on this and gathered together all of these high frequency indicators that they all have some piece of information about the overall economy. And what we want to do is extract, you can see there's a lot of noise here, right? They're highly variable, they're moving up and down a lot. And what we want to do is extract from all these series the underlying economic message, essentially take the signal out, and that's the red line. So that's our UHERO Economic Pulse Index. And it's an index, we set it to 100 before the pandemic in March. And then we set the bottom, the trough, at 0. So the lost activity happened, we bottomed out, I think it was April 6th actually, and any movement of the index off of that bottom of 0 is recovery of the lost activity. So by early June, actually by mid-June, the index had recovered 36%, indicating that we had recovered about 36% of economic activity. So you can see that by mid-June, mobility was up, hours worked were up, small business revenue had recovered a little bit sooner and then was beginning to plateau. And then as you recall, I was talking about what happened in July, we saw this surge in COVID cases. Look what happens to mobility. It's the green line. And from beginning of July till end of July, mobility fell 20, 30 points. People were staying home. So even though we didn't have the new Oahu stay-at-home order yet, people were staying home. They weren't going to the restaurants that were open. They weren't going to the bars that were open. They weren't going to the movie theaters that had opened, and economic activity turned down. And so by September, economic activity we'd lost almost 20% of that recovery. And the index pointed towards a loss of jobs like we experienced in the recent jobs report that gave us the highest unemployment rate in the nation. The good news is that the index has turned, and this is an experimental index. We'll see if we get an increase in jobs in October. I think there's a pretty good shot at that with the reopening of tourism. And so we're seeing signs that the economy is beginning to recover again, and that's an important piece of our forecast, and it will inform our next forecast report. Let's turn to discussing how we come up with a forecast report. We're not actually forecasting tourism, we're really assuming the path of tourism. Really, there's so much uncertainty here, from what the virus spread looks like globally to when we will have testing that's widespread, to what type of policy. Will we have a national policy for testing people before they get on planes? Will we have additional economic stimulus for small businesses, et cetera? All of that comes into play. So instead of really doing forecasts in the near term, what we're doing is a set of assumptions, a set of scenarios. And in our baseline forecast, our baseline scenario, we assumed that tourism would reopen on October 15th. We got lucky. The governor could have picked November 1st. He picked October 15th, but we assumed that we would have 10% when visitors returned. We would have about 10% of the number of visitors that we saw in the second half of October last year. And then that would gradually increase until it was at 30% by December. So when the Christmas season would drive that recovery, but then it would really kind of flatten out through the first quarter of next year, because we were assuming that a vaccine wouldn't be widely available until summer of next year. And then when that vaccine became available, we'd have a more rapid recovery, and we'd actually get back to 65% recovery by the very end of 2021. In our optimistic scenario, we assumed that there was a national policy for manufacturing and providing tests, and that we began to see more use of rapid testing to allow for travel, to make people more comfortable with travel, to get kids back in school and businesses open. And so we saw a more rapid recovery, or we assumed a more rapid recovery. And then again, a little bit earlier vaccine availability, but still late in the first half, not quite as late as in the baseline. The low scenario is really, it's not off the table yet. It basically assumed that the state didn't reopen until December. But you could also think of this as what happens if there's so much spread on the mainland, and maybe tests become unavailable, that we end up with another shutdown. And there's a really wide spread between these different scenarios. So then once we've developed these assumptions, and you can choose which one you want. We want to confront them with the data. And the difference between the two different views, the one that makes it bigger, is you get slides that I wasn't going to show you. So I wasn't going to show you that slide. I was going to show you this slide next. So you compare our assumptions with the data. This is the daily data on arrivals that's now available through the Safe Travels app that DOH is running. And you can see the surge that happened on October 15th. Right, we're now plateauing at around between 3,500 and 4,000 visitors per day. Notice that many of those are going to the neighbor islands. Right, you have a much larger share of visitors going to Maui and to Kona than direct to Oahu right now, and that's different from the beginning. But what matters is that if these numbers were to continue at say close to 4,000 visitors a day, then we would probably end up for the second half of October with between 15 and 20% recovery of visitors compared to last year. So quite a bit stronger than our baseline assumption, right? So that suggests that you might want to take a more optimistic view in interpreting these numbers. So when we take those assumptions and run them through our model, we get scenarios for visitor arrivals, and these are in millions of visitors. So, this is the 10 million visitors a year range, right? 2.5 per quarter. The range of uncertainty here is so large that if the virus were to surge across the whole country and even globally, like it is in places like Iowa and Wisconsin right now, where you're looking at 30-40% of the population is testing positive, or 30% of the tests are coming back positive, then we're talking about a difference of almost 1 million visitors a quarter between our optimistic forecast, where you have people feeling more comfortable with traveling and widespread use of tests, and our pessimistic forecast, where people feel much less comfortable with travel. So, one of the key takeaways is that take all this with a grain of salt, because there's, it depends on the spread of the virus. It depends on the availability and the success of a vaccine. It depends on particularly federal policy for national policies on manufacturing tests, on testing for travel, on getting kids back to school, and the macroeconomic effects, right? So the longer that the pandemic goes on, the bigger the macro fallout the bigger the impact on potential travelers. Right now, the macro fallout is really very, very focused on the lowest income households, right? The upper end of the income distribution. These are people who mostly can work from home, who have seen very little loss of income, who have seen their home values and their stock portfolios grow quite sharply. And in contrast, people at the lower end of the income distribution who work in service jobs where there's a lot of personal contact have lost jobs in hospitality and tourism and elsewhere. So there's the possibility that the longer this goes on, the macro fallout expands and has a more negative effect on tourism altogether. So this is a summary slide of sort of economic outlook for Hawaii from our baseline forecast. So the baseline forecast has a 14% drop in jobs statewide. The neighbor islands combined is about a 17% job loss for the year, with Maui getting hit the hardest because it's the most reliant on tourism statewide, followed by Kauai and then the Big Island. Real income growth for the year is a little over 5% drop. The reason for that distinction is all of the federal support programs that we already saw, the PPP loans, the direct payments, the $1,200 checks to households, the unemployment benefits and the expanded unemployment benefits. And then the reason that we get in our May forecast, we had a much stronger job recovery in 2021. With the delay of tourism reopening, that got pushed back to the second half. And so it shows up mostly in 2022. That may very well change with the stronger than anticipated recovery of tourism. And then you don't get much of a recovery in income. In fact, you don't get a recovery in income next year because, at least in our baseline, we didn't assume additional federal support. And if, there was at the end of December, the pandemic unemployment assistance that is providing unemployment benefits for self-employed workers goes away. And at the end of December, the emergency unemployment benefits that get people an additional 13 weeks ends. And then we're left with state emergency unemployment benefits that only go another 13 weeks. And so without significant additional federal support, the income recovery is going to be very, very muted. So I'm just skipping some slides that I didn't intend to show. And let's talk about housing for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So these three slides, the top two and the one in the left corner are all index data. So in other words, I take all the data and I convert it to start at 100. So everything starts at 100. And so then if you look at, so for example, look at Honolulu, these are single family resales. So in the first quarter of 2018, I set that to 100. So if you're at 135 in the third quarter of 2019, that's a 35% increase in sales, right? So between beginning of 2018 and the third quarter, we saw about a 35% increase in sales. So where are we now? So compared to the beginning of 2018, we've seen sales growth on Oahu. This is single family resales. So resales on Oahu are up about 40%, not that much different than they were a year ago. They've recovered sharply, right? So a lot of what we're seeing is a recovery from the shutdown, right? The stay-at-home order from April and May, and we've also seen sharp recovery on the Big Island, and we've seen recovery on all the islands. Just we're not back at levels. We're just back at 2018 levels on Kauai, and we have not recovered to 2018 levels on Maui. So that's single family. Condo resales, in contrast, are lower than 2018 levels on all islands except Oahu. Oahu has just now gotten back to 2018 levels and is quite a bit below where it was in the third quarter of 2019. And so what we're seeing is this dichotomy between single family, what is presumably single family, less dense, larger, more space, right? More rooms for your home office, maybe a yard for your kids to play in, or at least get your kids farther away from your home office, and less activity in condos. And we're seeing similar kinds of things in prices. This is the single family median price, and it's above 2018 levels on all islands. On Oahu, it's about 10% above where it was at the beginning of 2018. On Maui, on Big Island and Kauai, about 15%, and on Maui, about 5%. And so one additional chart showing the sort of dichotomy between single family and condo is this lower chart that shows median days on market, with the median days on market. I believe the Oahu single family median days on market is near record lows. It's certainly at record lows over this sample period, but I'm pretty sure it's very close to record lows for as far back as I have data. And in contrast, condo median days on market have been rising, and in fact, they're at levels we haven't seen since 2012, which was really still at the very beginning of the stronger part of the economic recovery in the state. So, an important question is we're experiencing what appears to be a very strong demand, but also a very severe shortage of resale supply. And the fundamental question is what's going to happen to demand and to supply over the next several years. And what we've experienced on Oahu so far, this is population data measured on the right axis on Oahu in 2016, 2017, 2018, we've seen declining population. 2019 was a decline in population. We anticipate an acceleration in that population decline really in 2021 and into 2022 because of the job losses, because of the job and income losses, and because Hawaii's recovery is going to be more muted than the rest of the country. Right? In fact, we've already seen that our economy fell much more sharply. But we also anticipate that the recovery will take longer because of our reliance on tourism and because there will be lingering effects of the pandemic on people's willingness to travel. The other factor that comes into play is the supply side, right? So right now on Oahu, statewide, Hawaii is in the top 5 of states in terms of non-current mortgages. So there's a very real chance that when moratoriums on foreclosures and moratoriums on evictions end, there will be an increased supply of housing that's coming from foreclosed properties. Now, many of these, the vast majority of these, so we're at actually this data, there's a preliminary number that just came out that's not in this chart. This is from our high frequency dashboard. The preliminary number for September for Hawaii is over 9%. It's 9.15% of mortgages are not current. And as I was about to say, the vast majority of those, I think the 90+ day delinquent rate is 60%. Now, most of those are going to be in some kind of forbearance program, right? And so the question is, what happens to those forbearance programs? If the pandemic only lasted 3 months and everybody went back to work, and most of these mortgages had positive equity, then working out those loans would have been relatively straightforward. But when you go 6 months, a year, or a year and a half without making payments, it gets a lot harder to just extend the loan. And so that's a real question, is how those are going to be worked out. We have seen a small increase in foreclosures, but it's still in the sub 2% range. So another impact on supply that we've talked about in the past is vacation rentals that have are having a hard time because either they're not permitted, right? So actually our estimate of the number of short-term vacation rentals on Oahu that are either not in a resort zone or not permitted is pretty close to 7,000. And initially these even legal vacation rentals were not being allowed to operate. Now legal vacation rentals are allowed to operate. Illegal vacation rentals are technically, they were never supposed to operate, but they're also deemed non-essential. And you know, on Kauai, they reached an agreement with the rental platforms to not list units that don't have permits. So if Oahu comes up with an agreement like that, then all of these condos and in some cases single family homes, many cases single family homes that were in the vacation rental market are going to either be in the long-term rental market, they're going to be taken off the market, or they're going to be put in the for sale market. And I think if you look at the sort of low end of the condo market, particularly on Oahu around Waikiki, you'll see that there's been an increase in activity there, and many of those are likely former short-term vacation rentals. So there's another potential for, and this is a potentially large increase in supply, right? If you look at total transactions of condos last year on Oahu, it was probably about 5,000 units. And so the combination of potentially falling demand through population, but growing supply through foreclosures or evictions or short-term vacation rentals sort of raises the question of whether this pent-up demand and shortage of supply that has started off with this pandemic is going to continue. And I mean, I don't have an answer for that. We will come up with a forecast update in the next quarter, but it's the uncertainty in the overall economy just extends to the housing market completely. This is survey data from the U.S. Bureau of Census, and this is rents. These are data for renters, and it's done by income bucket. And so even for people, this is data for adults. It's the share of Hawaii adults with income greater than 75,000 who live in a household that is basically struggling to pay their rent. They've either missed rent payments or they don't expect to make rent payments in the future. And so even in the median income or above, remember these are adults. So you put multiple adults in a home making 75,000 or above, then you're above median household income at that point. And so we're looking at 10 to 20% of these adults are unable to make their rent, and of course the numbers grow as income distribution, as you move down the income distribution. And the same thing goes for mortgages for homeowners. Even adults living in households where adults with income over 75,000 are looking at inability to pay mortgage payments, which this is not a surprise given a 15% unemployment rate, right? So you had an income of over 75,000, but you're not working. It's very, very challenging to cover housing costs. And so again, the question is, how is this going to work out, and what are the implications for housing in Hawaii? So finally, I'll just wrap up with there's still, this was a pretty negative presentation. There's a lot of doom and gloom to spread around. There is optimism, I think, on the tourism recovery. It's going to require that we manage the virus carefully, and that we all wear masks and so on. But there are also opportunities as we go forward to rebuild and reposition tourism. Actually, we released a blog post last week about charging more for tourism attractions, particularly at the beach, not beach parks, but at places like Hanauma Bay, and the city recently raised fees there. There's a lot of opportunity for repositioning Hawaii's economy, and and I mentioned we talked a little bit about changing density and what that's doing in housing. There's also a possibility that the population decline that we're forecasting won't occur because of inflow of population as people increase their telework. It becomes more possible to live and work from Hawaii, even if your primary employment is elsewhere. And then something else that none of us have thought of yet is definitely an opportunity. And I want to just close real quickly and open it up to questions. I want to thank all of our supporters that have come together to help UHERO to fund essentially to start a fund to add to our faculty, to pay for new positions with contributions and private money, so that we can continue to do what we're doing and do even more. Mahalo.
Thank you, Dr. Bonham. We do have a few questions that came in. The first one being, can you define macro fallout?
Yeah, sorry about that. So macro is macroeconomics. So in other words, I apologize for using economic jargon. So macroeconomic fallout means people who have lost their jobs and have had to rely on their credit card to pay their rent or to keep their business afloat, has taken on more debt, or have had to sell off property or whatever they've had to do to survive through the pandemic, both in Hawaii and globally, particularly people from the U.S. mainland or from Japan or elsewhere. The decline in income and job losses impacts their willingness to travel to Hawaii and their ability and willingness to spend money. And it has implications for tourism, it has implications for housing and consumer spending overall.
Thank you. Also, we had a question here about the median home sales. They're asking if luxury properties bought by mainland or wealthy clients relocating to Oahu has caused the median home sales to go to be higher, or is it not so much that home values have gone up?
So we don't. That's a really good question. So actually, I meant to. So there is some data on through, I want to say title guarantee, but I'm not certain it's title guarantee that provides information to DBED on the sort of the home address of housing transactions. And so that's one source of information on where the buyers are coming from, right? And so I don't know right now if we can argue that we have hard data that says that the reason that home prices are going up is because of offshore buyers. We will eventually have harder data on that. And I apologize for not having gone to dig that one piece of information up. What we do know is that the lower end of the housing price distribution is not seeing the kind of movement that we're seeing at the upper end. So the mix is changing, right? If what you're trying to accomplish by moving from one home to another or moving out of a rental into a house is to have more space, then by definition we're going to be at the higher end of the home price distribution. And as the mix of home sells, right? If you simply sell more homes at 800,000 than than we did 6 months ago, and you sell very many fewer homes that are in the $500,000 or $600,000 range, then the median is going to go up. And actually, this is something that we're working on for our next forecast report, is to dig into the data much more detail to try to figure out exactly what's causing the median to rise.
Okay, thank
and
you.
The other thing is you really also need a repeat sale index to be able to know what's happening to underlying values. Because if you're a repeat sale index tracks the sales prices of properties repeatedly, right? They sell multiple times. And without that, you're selling homes of different quality and different characteristics. And so, if 6 months and a year ago, we were selling homes of relatively lower quality, relatively smaller size, relatively older, and now we're selling, the sales are mostly larger, newer, then that by itself is going to move the median price, even though those homes may not actually have gone up in value, because you have to compare the same properties.
We also have a few questions regarding tourism. So the first one being where the bulk of visitors are coming from.
So another great question. And the short answer right now is that we don't know. I mean, as you know, so in that daily data, I can't tell you where those visitors are coming from. I can tell you where they normally come from, right? So traditionally, almost 40% of our visitors would be from California. And so the top 5 states that would normally send visitors to us would be, I think I have the order right, California. Well, I won't try and get the, I know California's top. I think Washington might be next. Texas would be in that group, Oregon, Colorado. Those are the top 5. I think Colorado is 5th, Texas might be 4th, Washington and Oregon might be in the, but there's a huge difference. I mean, California is close to 40% last year. Washington's probably 11%. So you get and that's a share of total visitors to the state. They're domestic visitors in 2019. So if the pattern is the same, then that's what's going on. And we've actually been talking about whether we can use some of the mobility data, the cell phone tracking data that we have access to get immediate data on where people are coming from, because that matters. It matters a lot. If everybody was coming, fortunately, we get very few visitors from the, from the Dakotas and from Wisconsin and Iowa, where positivity rates are really, really high.
And that sort of goes into this next question where it says, this phase of tourism that we're in seems to have not spiked COVID cases. Is it safe to say, in your opinion, that we can expand the visitor and hospitality industries?
So the basic thought is that the pre-flight testing program is likely to catch between 70 and 80% of people who might have COVID. And if you take out of any population, the people who are about to get on a plane, the people who are about to travel are also going to self-select, right? You're not going to go book an airline ticket if you've got symptoms. And there's also additional screening, right? There's the health app that requires reporting on other symptoms, and out of an existing population, the CDC numbers suggest that about half of that population might be carrying the virus, or half of the normal share. So we know what proportion of people from, say, California are being tested positive. Well, only about half of that number would be what you would expect in the general population. And then you apply an 80% rule for the testing, you end up with the visitors coming here being less likely to have the virus than the people who already live here. So I don't think that the visitors are really imposing a large risk on us. I think the biggest risk is our own behavior. So you imagine a group of workers who are back at a restaurant or back at some kind of an entertainment venue, maybe at the zoo, or they're back at work at a hotel, and then they decide to go out to eat for dinner, or they decide to go out and do pauhana wherever. Maybe, since you can't go to a bar, they tailgate. And then if they're doing that without social distancing and without masks, I think that's the greater risk, right? It's not so much that I think we're going to catch it from people who are traveling as we're going to spread it ourselves. And we've already demonstrated we're completely capable of spreading the virus ourselves within our own population. And it's usually gatherings, relatively large gatherings, without social distancing and without masks. So can we expand it further? I think we need to. I think we will. And we don't yet have the data. We haven't had tourism open long enough to see the full incubation period and to see what the effects are. My guess is that when we get to that point, it'll be late next week. We won't have seen a significant increase in cases, but 2 weeks after Halloween, we may very well see an increase in cases.
And I think we have time for one more question. I think you touched upon this towards the end of your presentation about the current situation with the market. Multiple offer situations are prevalent right now. Do you think this will continue?
That's a great question. I wish I had a clear crystal ball that would tell me. The thing that, obviously the thing that's driving the market right now is lack of inventory, right? And if you're in the kind of property that people want, you're not likely to put it on the market and say move to a retirement condo. So there's going to be some pent up demand there. I think it's probably limited. You can't. I think that there's definitely risk to the downside in 2021 and 2022. The multiple offers are almost certainly going to continue for the next several months, maybe even halfway into 2021. But I think that longer term, there's downside risk because of population decline. There's downside risk because of the coming evictions and coming foreclosures, and there's downside risk from a prolonged period of slow economic recovery.
Thank you, Dr. Bonham, and mahalo for taking the time to speak with us and for your very informative presentation.